Indiana here with another episode of the Star Wars podcast. Today's topic is Crucible by Troy Denning. Um, so my thoughts on the story. I thought it was interesting. I liked it. It wasn't necessarily my favorite. My favorite would still have to be Heir to the Empire, but I thought it was a good story nonetheless. But my favorite part of the whole thing were the bad guys. The rest was okay, but I could, really care less for all the Mortis stuff, for all the Force stuff. I really liked the bad guys, the Kraft brothers. I kind of wish there's more of them in the book, as I don't feel like we completely got to know them as well, or they weren't made as in depth as they could have been, though they were pretty well put together for only having one book. I'll get more into them later, but a couple of themes in the book that I noticed was probability versus luck, which you can often see in the ideas of Sabic and the Kraft brothers, because the Kraft brothers often, though people say they were always two steps ahead, that's because they base their decisions off of probability or likeliness of what's to happen. Whereas you see with Han Solo, especially in Sabec, he's playing off of luck, um, known as, the Solo's luck, because the Solos are apparently lucky. So you have the idea that's in many different stories of basically fate versus um fate versus luck, or probability versus chance, or whatever you want to call it. Han Solo's going for luck. Actually, this would more be a breakdown of chance. It'd be probability or luck. Probability is one version of chance, whereas luck's another one of just something that happens to happen. Um, Han Solo has several lucky situations in the book, and poker games such as Sabbath are always based on luck, about what card you get and how your opponent reacts. So, yeah, that's one of the underlying themes in the story. The other one I noticed was, by the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, this has some spoilers. The other one was the Force, or more like the breakdown of good versus evil and how it all works. In the end, Troy didn't, Luke Skywalker's like, we need the dark side, or there's no need for the Force at all. There's no need for the light, because it's the only reason the Force is there is because there's a balance needed in between dark side and the light side, and without the dark side, there can be no light side, and things are just going to continue on the exact same way there is, because there's never going to be any problems. So for things to be able to change, you gotta have people, and you gotta have the different sides of life. Though you may be on one side, you're simply there to help combat the other. So that's the other theme in the book that's kind of going on during this. I just kind of want to point out. Now let's get to the bad guys, the Kreft brothers. They are Columni, and Columni are known for being very smart beings, though they do not have force sensibility. So, why I like these? They remind me of Thrawn. They aren't like Thrawn at all, except for in their ability to kind of be a couple steps ahead of you. As Thrawn was always a couple steps ahead of his opponents, Kraft Brothers are always a couple steps ahead of theirs. Now, what makes the Kraft Brothers the way they are? Number one, probability. They are always thinking on their feet. They're thinking of the most likely thing to happen, and they are going for it. Number two, they are businessmen. They own Galactic Syndicate. They're going to do what is best for them, and they are going to take over the galaxy through economics, which is a very interesting idea in Star Wars because of the fact that most occurrences in Star Wars of threats to the galaxy are Sith or another military threat, such as the Empire, or is a political threat, like Borscht Leia and Admiral Akbar's trial or whatever that happened in the Thrawn trilogy, or the taking over of the Senate by Palpatine. This isn't a political struggle or necessarily a military struggle, though it does have military stuff in it. It does have political stuff in it. The underlying reason for it happening isn't military, it's economics. Military is simply a way for them to keep their business going. It's a business for them. They are using their military abilities to take over other businesses so they can get in there and own them. It makes them very interesting, and Troy Denning purposely tried to make a different kind of bad guy for this book, which I think the bad guys is really what makes it up. Although the downfall of the Kraft brothers is ultimately their selfishness and the search for having the Force ability, because they want everything they don't have. They go after Lando Calrissian's business because they don't have that and they want that part of the market. So they're going to go after the Force because that's one thing that can make them even stronger. They want to have Force powers, so they search for it. But this is their downfall as they're trying to do ultimately what they cannot, and it possesses them, makes them evil. They fell to the wrong side. Though they were obviously already evil, they did the wrong thing. And so they became that, and they ended up dying in a very unique way, um, in a very unnatural way, to Luke and Leia. It's basically power versus dark and light, and which one's to overcome. Is it the dark or the light? And the light ultimately overcame the dark as it perpetrated it. So I think that, to me, the bad guy, the Kraft brothers, these two Columni, Mirvad and Kratheus, I think, if I remember their names correctly, they were wonderful bad guys and loved the way Troy Denning created them. I wish he put a little bit more detail in the how they were always two steps ahead type of thing, but ultimately they were wonderful. And if they were still alive, I'd love to see them again, but they're not. So let's get on to the rest. Uh, the main other thing I wanted to point out was the reason this book was made. So, for years, people have been writing books based off of Luke, Leia, and Han, and now there are about 40 years worth of books in the Star Wars universe, not in our universe, because these books have only been written for about 20 years. But anyways, there's about 40 years of Star Wars timeline filled in with books. So Troy Denning was hired to write The Crucible as a retirement story because they were going to start, focusing on Ben Skywalker, his son, and the next generation. So this is Johanna and her husband, and they were going to start focusing on this, which obviously by the time this book was written in 2013, so Disney bought it soon after, bought it around the time this book was released, and last year they announced the canon stuff, so all that was planned to come after that book didn't happen, but the point was for this to be a retirement story for the characters, and it was meant to lead into help lead into other stories where Ben Skywalker and his cousin Diana were now the focus of these stories, and other characters as well. So yeah, I hope I would suggest this as a read. Um, I don't necessarily think it's the best Star Wars book out there, but if you haven't read it and you've read most other Star Wars books, go on ahead. And I'm sure there are much worse ones out there. As this one is still a great read. Maybe not necessarily for the story, as I could care less about that, but for the bad guys, as the bad guys, the Croft brothers, are just amazing, and I really love them. They're not my favorite bad guy ever, but I think they were magnificently put together, and that's why you should read the story, to read about the bad guys. So, this is Indiana, signing out. See you guys later.